Good afternoon. This is Knowledge Time. Welcome, alchemists. Today I'll be reading from the book The Laws of Human Nature by Robert Greene. Currently, I am in beginning chapter 12. Connect to the masculine or feminine within you. The law of gender rigidity. All of us have masculine and feminine qualities. Some of this is genetic, and some of it comes from the profound influence of the parent of the opposite sex. But in the need to present a consistent identity in society, we tend to repress these qualities, over identifying with the masculine or feminine role expected of us, and we pay a price for this. We lose valuable dimensions to our character. Our thinking and ways of acting become rigid. Our relationships with members of the opposite sex suffer as we project onto them our own fantasies and hostilities. You must become aware of these lost masculine or feminine traits and slowly reconnect to them, unleashing creative powers in the process. You will become more fluid in your thinking, in bringing out the masculine or feminine undertone to your character. You will fascinate people by being authentically yourself. Do not play the expected gender role, but rather create the one that suits you. Part 1. The authentic gender. As a young girl, Catarina Sforza dreamed of great deeds that she would be a part of as a member of the illustrious Sforza family of Milan. Born in 1463, Catarina was the daughter out of wedlock of a beautiful Milanese noblewoman and Lazario Maria Sforza, who became Duke of Milan upon the death of his father in 1466. As Duke, Galazzo ordered that his daughter be brought into the castle, Porta Giovia, where he lived with his new wife, and that she be raised like any legitimate member of the Sforza family. His wife, Catarina, stepmother, treated her as one of her own. The girl was to have the finest education. The man who had served as Galazzo's tutor, the famous humanist Francisco Filelfo, will now serve as Catarina's tutor. He taught her Latin, Greek, philosophy, the sciences, and even military history. Often alone, Karina would wander almost daily into the vast castle library, one of the largest in Europe. She had her favorite books that she would read over and over. One of these was a history of the Sforza family, written by Filelfo himself in the style of Homer. There, in this enormous volume with its elaborate illustrations, she would read about the remarkable rise to power of the Sforza family, from condottieri captains in mercenary armies to ruling the Duchy of Milan itself. The Sforzas were renowned for their cleverness and bravery in battle. Along with this, she loved to read books that recounted the chivalric tales of real-life knights in armor and the stories of great leaders in the past. Among these, one of her favorites was Illustrious Women by Boccaccio, which related the deeds of the most celebrated women in history. And as she whiled away her time in the library, all of these books converging in her mind, she would daydream about the future glory of the family, somehow herself in the midst of it all. And at the center of these fantasies was the image of her father, a man who to her was a was as great and legendary as anyone she had read about. Although the encounters although the encounters with her father were often brief, to Karina they were intense. He treated her as an equal, marveling at her intelligence and encouraging her in her studies. From early on, she identified with her father, experiencing his traumas and triumphs as if they were her own, as as were all the Sforza children, girls included. Katerina was taught sword fighting and underwent rigorous physical training. As part of this side of her education, she would go on hunting expeditions with the family in the nearby woods of Pavia. She was trained to hunt and kill wild boars, stags, and other animals. On these excursions, she would watch her father with awe. He was a superior horseman, riding with such impetuosity as if nothing could harm him. In the hunt, taking on the largest animals, he showed no signs of fear. At court, he was the consummate diplomat, yet always maintained the upper hand. He confided in her his methods. Think ahead. Plot several moves in advance, always with the goal of seizing the initiative in any situation. Wow. There was another side to her father, however, that deepened her identification with him. He loved spectacle. He was like an artist. She would never forget the time the family toured the region and visited Florence. They brought with them various theater trophies, the actors wearing outlandish costumes. They dined in the country inside the most beautifully colored tents. On the march, the brightly comparis, comparis, comparised horses and the accompanying soldiers, all decked in the Sforza colors, scarlet and white, would fill the landscape. It was a hypnotic and thrilling sight, all orchestrated by her father. He delighted in always wearing the latest in Milanese fashions, with his elaborate and bejeweled silk gowns. She came to share this interest. Clothes and jewels became her passion. She might seem so virile in battle, but she would see him crying like a baby as he listened to his favorite choral music. He had an endless appetite for all aspects of life, and her love and admiration for him knew no bounds. And so in 1473, when her father informed the 10-year-old Catarina of the marriage he had arranged for her, her only thought was to fulfill her duty as a Sforza and please her father. The man Galeazzo had chosen for her was G, Girolamo Rario, the 30-year-old nephew of Pope Sixtus VI, a marriage that would forge a valuable alliance between Rome and Milan. As part of the arrangement, the Pope purchased the city of Imola in Romagna, which the Sforza had taken decades before, christening the new couple the Count and Countess of Imola. Later, the Pope would add the nearby town of Forli to their possessions, giving them control of a very strategically located part of eastern Italy, just south of Venice. In her initial encounters with him, Caterina's husband seemed a most unpleasant man. He was moody, self-absorbed, and high-strung. He appeared interested in her only for sex and could not wait for her to come of age. Fortunately, he continued to live in Rome and she stayed in Milan. But a few years later, some disgruntled nobleman in Milan murdered her beloved father, and the power of the Sforzas seemed in jeopardy. Her position as the marriage marriage pawn, solidifying the partnership with Rome was now more important than ever. She quickly installed herself in Rome. There would have to play the exemplary wife and keep on the good side of her husband. But the more she saw of Girolamo, the less she respected him. He he was a hothead, making enemies wherever he turned. She had not imagined that a man could be so weak, and compared with her father, he failed by every measure. She turned her attention to the Pope. She worked hard to gain his favor and that of his courtiers. Caterina was now a beautiful young woman with blonde hair, a novelty in Rome. She ordered the she ordered the most elaborate gowns to be sent from Milan. She made sure to never be seen wearing the same outfit twice. If she sported a turban with a long veil, it suddenly became the latest craze. She revealed in the attention she received as the most fashionable woman in Rome. Bada, Botticelli, using her as a model for some of his greatest paintings, being so well read and cultivated, she was the delight of the artists and writers in town, and the Romans began to warm up to her. Within a few years, however, everything unraveled. Her husband in, instigated a feud with one of the leading families in Italy, the Colonnas. Then in 1484, the Pope suddenly died, and without his protection, Catarina and her husband were in grave danger. The Colonnas were plotting their revenge. The Romans hated Girolamo, and it was almost a certainty that the new Pope would be a friend of the Colonnas, in which case Catarina and her husband would lose everything, including the towns of Forli and Imola. I lost my. Considering the weak position of her own family in Milan, the situation began to look desperate. Until a new pope was elected, Girolamo was still the captain of the papal, papal armies, now stationed just outside Rome. For days, Caterina watched her husband, who was paralyzed with fear and unable to make a decision. He dared not enter Rome, fearing battle with the Colonnas and their many allies in the crowded streets. He would wait it out, but with time, their options seemed to narrow, and the news kept getting worse. Mobs had sacked the palace they lived in. What few allies they had in Rome had now deserted them. The cardinals were congregating to elect a new pope. It was August, and the sweltering heat made Caterina 7 months pregnant, and with 7 months pregnant with her fourth child, feel faint and continually nauseated. But as she contemplated the impending doom, the thought of her father began to occupy her mind. It was as if she could feel his spirit inhabiting her, thinking as he would think about the predicament she faced. She felt a rush of excitement as she formulated an audacious plan. Without telling a soul of her intentions, in the dark of night, she mounted a horse and snuck out of camp, riding as fast as she could to Rome. As she had expected in her condition, no one recognized her, and she was allowed to enter the city. She headed straight for the Castel Saint Angelo, the most strategic point in Rome, just across the Tiber River from the city center, and close to the Vatican, with its impregnable walls and its cannons that could be aimed at all parts of Rome. The person who controlled the castle controlled the city. Rome was Rome was in tumult, mobs filling the streets everywhere. The castle was still held by a lieutenant loyal to Girolamo. Identifying herself, Caterina was led into Saint and Angelo. Once inside, in the name of her husband, she took possession of the castle, throwing out the lieutenant, whom she did not trust, sending word out. sending word out through the castle to soldiers who swore loyalty to her. She managed to smuggle in more troops, with the cannons of Saint Angelo now pointing at all roads leading to the Vatican. She made it possible for the cardinals to meet in one location and elect the new pope. To make her threats real, she had her soldiers fire the cannons as a warning. She meant business. Her terms of surrendering the castle were simple: that all of the property of the Ria Rios be guaranteed to remain in their hands, including Forli and Imola. A few evenings after she had taken over San Angelo, wearing some armor over her gown, she marched along the ramparts of the castle. It gave her a feeling of great power, so far above the city, looking down at the frantic men below, helpless to fight against her, a single woman hobbled by pregnancy. When an envoy of the cardinal who was organizing the conclave to elect the new pope was sent to negotiate with her and seemed reluctant to agree to her conditions of surrender, she shouted down from the ramparts, so all could hear. "So the cardinal wants a battle of wits with me, does he? What he doesn't understand is that I have the brains of Duke Galazio, and I am as brilliant as he." It's a bold statement. As she waited for their response, she knew she controlled the situation. Her only fear was that her husband would surrender and betray her, or that the August heat would make her too ill to wait it out. Finally, sensing her resolve, a group of cardinals came to the castle to negotiate, and they acceded to her demands. The following morning, as the drawbridge was lowered to let the countess leave the castle, she noticed an enormous crowd pushing close to her. Romans of all classes had come to catch a glimpse of the woman who had controlled Rome for 11 days. They had taken the countess for a rather frivolous young woman addicted to clothes, the Pope's little pet. Now they started at her in astonishment. She was wearing one of her silk gowns, with a heavy sword dangling from a man's belt, her pregnancy more than evident. They had never seen such a sight. Their titles now secure, the Count and Countess moved to Forli to rule their domain. With no more funds coming from the papacy, Girolamo's main concern was how to get more money, and so he increased the taxes on his subjects, stirring up much discontent in the process. He quickly made enemies of the powerful Orsi family in the region. Fearing plots against his life, the Count holed himself up in their palace. Slowly, Catarina took over much of the day-to-day ruling of their realm. Thinking ahead, she installed a trusted ally as the new commander of the castle, Rivaldino, which dominated the area. She did everything she could to integrate herself with the locals, but in a few short years, her husband had done too much damage. Oh. On April 14th, 1488, a group of men, clad in armor and led by Lodovico Arsi, stormed into the palace and stabbed the Count to death, throwing his body out the window and into the city square. Wow. The Countess, dining with her family in a nearby room, heard the shouts and quickly shuffled her 6 children into a safer room in the palace's tower. She bolted the door and from a window under which several of her most trusted allies had gathered. She shouted instructions to them. They were to notify the Sforzas in Milan and her other allies in the region and urge them to send armies to rescue her. Under no circumstances should the keeper of Ravildino ever surrender the castle. Within minutes, the assassins had broken into her room, taking her and her children captive. Several days later, Lodovico Arce and his fellow conspirator Giacomo del Ronchi marched Catarina up to Cavaladino. She was to order the castle's commander to surrender it to the assassins. As the commander, she had installed Tommaso Feo looked down from the rampart. Catarina seemed to fear for her life, her voice breaking with emotion. She begged Feo to give up the fortress, but he refused. As the two of them continued their dialogue, Ronchi and Arcee sensed the Countess and Feo were playing some sort of game, talking in code. Ronchi had had enough of this. Pressing the sharp edge of his lance tight against her chest, he threatened to run her through unless she got Feo to surrender, and he gave her the sternest glare. Suddenly, the Countess' expression changed. She leaned further into the blade, her face inches from Ronchi's, and with a voice dripping with disdain, she told him, "Oh, Giacomo del Ronchi, don't you try to frighten me. You can hurt me, but you can't scare me, because I am the daughter of a man who knew no fear. Do you want do what you want. You have killed my lord. You can certainly kill me. After all, I'm just a woman." Confounded by her words and demeanor, Ronchi and Arcee decided they had to find other means to pressure her. Several days later, Feo communicated with the assassins that he would indeed hand over the fortress, but only if the Countess would pay him his back wages and sign a letter absolving him from any guilt for such surrender. Once again, Arcee and Ronchi led her to the castle and watched her closely as she seemed to negotiate with Feo. Finally, Feo insisted that the Countess enter the fortress to sign the document. He feared the assassins were trying to trick him, and he insisted she entered alone. Once the letter was signed, he would do as he had promised. The conspirators, feeling they had no choice, granted his request but gave the Countess a brief time frame to conclude the business. For a fleeting moment, just as she disappeared over the drawbridge into Valley, Ravaldino, she turned with a sneer and gave the Italian equivalent of the finger to Ronchi and Arcee. The entire drama of the past few days had been planned and staged by her and Feo, with whom she had communicated through various messengers. She knew that the Milanese had sent an army to rescue her, and she only had to play for time. A few hours later, Feo stood on the ramparts and yelled down that he was holding the Countess hostage, and that was that. The enraged assassins had had enough. The next day, they returned to the castle with her 6 children and called Carina to the ramparts, with daggers and spears pointing at them in the most menacing fashion. And with the children wailing and begging for mercy, they ordered Catarina to surrender the fortress, or they would kill them all. Surely they had already proven they were more than willing to shed blood. She might be fearless and the daughter of a Sforza, but no mother could possibly watch her children die before her eyes. Catarina wasted no time. She shouted down, "Do it then! Do it then, you fools! I am already pregnant with another child by Count Riario, and I have the means to make more." At which she lifted her skirts as if to emphasize her meaning. Carina had foreseen the maneuver with the children and had calculated that the assassins were weak and indecisive. They should have killed her and her family on that day amid the mayhem. Now, they would not dare to kill them in cold blood. The assassins knew that the Sforzas on their way to Forli would take terrible revenge on them if they ever did such a deed. And if she surrendered now, she and her children would all be in prison, and some poison would find its way into their food. She didn't care what they thought of her as a mother. She had to keep Stalin. To emphasize her resolve, after refusing to surrender, she had the cannons of the castles fire at the Orsi palace. 10 days later, a Milanese army arrived to rescue her, and the assassins scattered. The countess was quickly restored to power, the new pope himself confirming her rule as regent until her eldest son, Octavino, came of age. And as word of all that she had done and what she had yelled down to the assassins from the ramparts of Ravadino spread throughout Italy, the legend of Catarina Sforza, the beautiful warrior countess of Forli, began to take on a life of its own. Within a year after the death of her husband, the countess had taken a lover, Giacomo Feo, the brother of the commander she had installed in Ravallindino. Giacomo was 7 years younger than Caterina, and he was the polar opposite of Girolamo, handsome and virile. He had come from the lower classes, having served as a stable boy to the Rario family. Most important, he not only loved Caterina, he worshipped her and showered her with attention. The countess had spent her whole life mastering her emotions and subordinating her personal interests to practical matters. Suddenly, feeling herself overwhelmed by Gaio Como's affection, she had lost her habitual habitual self-control and felt helpless in love. She made Giacomo the new commander of Ravallindino, as he now had to live in the castle. She built a palace for herself inside it and soon barely left its confines. Giacomo was decidedly insecure about his status. Caterina had him knighted, and in a secret ceremony they married. To ally with self-doubts, she increasingly handed over to him governing powers of Forli and Imola, and began to retire from public affairs. She ignored the warnings of courtiers and diplomats that Giacomo was out for himself and was in over his head. She did not listen to her sons. She feared Giacomo had plans to get rid of them. In her eyes, her husband could do no wrong. Then one day in 1495, as she and Giacomo left the castle for a picnic, a group of assassins surrounded her husband and killed him before her eyes. Caught off guard by this action, Caterina reacted with fury. She rounded up the conspirators and had them executed and their families imprisoned. In the months after this, she fell into a deep depression, even contemplating suicide. What had happened to her over the past years? How had she lost her way and given up her powers? What had happened to her girlhood dreams and the spirit of her father that was her own? Something had clouded her mind. She turned to religion, and she returned to ruling her realm. Slowly, she recovered. Then one day she received a visit from Giovanni de' Medici, a 30-year-old member of the famous family and one of Florence's leading businessmen. He had come to forge commercial ties between the cities. More than anyone else, he reminded her of her father. He was handsome, clever, extremely well-read, and yet there was a softness to his character. Finally, here was a man who was her equal in knowledge, power, and refinement. The admiration was mutual. Soon they were inseparable, and in 1498 they married, uniting two of the most illustrious families in Italy. Now she could finally dream of creating a great regional power, but events beyond her control would spoil her plans. That that same year, Giovanni died from illness, and before she had time to grieve for him, she had to deal with the latest and most dangerous threat of all to her realm. The new pope, Alexander the 11th, formerly known as Rodrigo Borgia, had the eye for Forli. He wanted to extend the papal domains throughout conquest. His son Cesare Borgi, serving as the commander of the papal service forces, Forli would be a key acquisition for the Pope, and he began to maneuver to political isolation. Catarina from her allies to prepare for the imminent invasion. Catarina forged a new alliance with the Venetians and built an elaborate series of defenses within Ravaldino. The Pope tried to pressure her to surrender her domain, making her all kinds of promises in return. She knew better than to trust Borghi, but by the fall of 19 the by but by the fall of 1499, it seemed that the end had finally come. The Pope had allied himself with France, and Caesar Borgi had appeared in the region with an army of 12,000, fortified by the addition of 2,000 experienced French soldiers. They quickly took Imola and easily entered the city of Forli itself. All that remained was Ravaldino, which by late December was surrounded by Borghi's troops. On December 26, Caesar Borgi himself rode up to the castle on his white horse, dressed all in black, quite a sight. As Catarina looked down from the ramparts and contemplated the scene, she thought of her father. It was the anniversary of his assassination. He represented everything she valued, and she would not disappoint him. She was the most like him of all his children, as he would have done. She had thought ahead. Her plan was to play for time until her remaining allies could come to her defense. She had cleverly fortified Ravdelino in a way that would allow her to keep retreating behind barricades if the walls were breached. In the end, they would have to take the castle from her by force, and she was more than prepared to die in defense of it, sword in hand. As she listened to Borghi's address, it was clear he had come to flatter and flirt. Everyone knew his reputation as a devilish seducer, and many in Italy thought Caterina had rather loose morals. She listened and smiled, occasionally reminding him of her past deeds and her reputation as a Sforza. If he wanted her to surrender, he would have to do better. He persisted in his courtship and asked to parley with her personally. She appeared to finally succumb to his charm. She was a woman, after all. She ordered the drawbridge to be lowered and started walking toward him. He continued to press his case, and she gave him certain looks and smiles that indicated she was falling under his spell. Now only inches away, he reached for her arm, and she playfully withdrew it. They should discuss matters in the castle, she said with a coy expression, and began to walk back, inviting him to follow. As he stepped into the drawbridge to catch up with her, it began to rise, and he... Excuse me. Wow. And he leaped back to the other side just in time. Enraged and embarrassed by the trick she had tried to play, he swore revenge. During the next few days, he unleashed a torrent of cannon fire at the castle walls, finally opening a breach. Borgi's troops flooded in, led by the more experienced French. It was now hand-to-hand combat, and at the front of her remaining troops was Caterina. The head of the French troops, Yavis de Allegra, stared at her in amazement as the beautiful countess, her ornamented cuirass over her dress, charged at his men from the front line, handling her sword di- defiantly with a trace of, without a trace of fear. She and her men were about to withdraw further into the castle, hoping to prolong the battle for days, as she had planned, when one of her soldiers grabbed her from behind and his sword at her throat marched her over to the other side. Borgia had put a price on her head, and the soldier had betrayed her for the reward. The siege was over, and Borgia himself took possession of his great prize. That night, he raped her and kept her confined in his rooms, trying to make it seem to the world that the infamous warrior countess had willingly succumbed to his charms. Even under duress, she refused to sign away her domain, and so she was brought to Rome and soon thrown into the dreaded prison at Castel Saint and Angelos. For one long year in a small and windowless cell, she endured her loneliness and the endless tortures devised by the Borgias. Her health deteriorated, and she seemed destined to die in prison, defiant to the end. But the chivalric French Captain Yves de Allegra had fallen under her spell. He persisted in demanding, in the name of the French king, to have her freed, and he finally succeeded, getting her safe passage to Florence. In retirement from public life, Catarina began to receive letters from men from all parts of Europe. Some had seen her over the years, most had only heard of her. They obsessed over her story, confessed their love, and begged for some memento, some relic to worship. One man, who had caught a glimpse of her when she had first come to Rome, wrote to her, "If I sleep, it seems that I am with you. If I eat, I leave my food and talk to you. You are engraved in my heart, weakened by her year weakened by her year in prison. The Countess died in 1509. Interpretation. In Caterina Safori's time, the roles that a woman could play were severely restricted. Her primary role was to be the good mother and wife, but if unmarried, she could devote her life to religion, or in rare cases, she could become a courtesan. It was as if a circle had been drawn around each and every woman, and she dared not explore beyond that circle. It was in a woman's earliest years and education that she internalized these restrictions. If she studied only a limited number of subjects and practiced only certain skills, she couldn't expand her role even if she wanted to. Knowledge was power. Caterina stands out as a remarkable exception, and it was because she benefited from a unique confluence of circumstances. The Sforzas were new to power. They had discovered in their rise to the top that a strong and capable wife could be of great assistance. They developed the practice of training their daughters in hunting and sword fighting as a way to toughen them up and make them fearless, important qualities to have as marriage pawns. Caterina's father, however, took this further. Perhaps he saw in his daughter a female reflection of himself. Giving her his own tutor signaled some sort of identification he felt between them. And so a unique experiment began in the castle as Porta Giovia isolated from the outside world and allowed a tremendous degree of freedom. Caterina could develop herself in any direction she desired. Intellectually, she could explore all forms of knowledge. She could indulge herself in all of her natural interests, in her case, fashion and the arts. In her physical training, she could give free rein to her own bold and adventurous spirit. In this early education, she could bring out the many different sides of her character. And so when she entered public life at the age of 10, she naturally drifted beyond that restricted circle imposed on women. She could play many roles. As a dutiful Sephoraza, she could be the loyal wife, naturally empathetic and caring. She could be the devoted mother. She felt great pleasure in being the most fashionable and beautiful young woman at the papal court. But when the actions of her husband appeared to doom her and her family, she felt herself called to play another role. Trained to think for herself and inspired by her father, she could turn into the daring soldier, bringing an entire city under her control. She could become the keen strategist, plotting several moves ahead in a crisis. She could lead her troops, sword in hand. As a young girl, she had fantasized about playing these various roles, and it felt natural and deeply satisfying to do so in real life. We could say of Catarina that she had a feminine spirit with a pronounced masculine undertone, the reverse of her father, and the feminine and masculine traits were blended together, giving her a unique style of thinking and acting. When it came to ruling, she displayed a high degree of empathy, something quite unusual for the time. When plague struck Forley, comf- she comforted the sick at great risk to her own life. She was willing to suffer the worst conditions in prison to safeguard the inheritance for her children, a rare act of self sacrifice for a person of power. But at the same time, she was a shrewd and tough negotiator, and she had no tolerance for the incompetent or the weak. She was ambitious and proud of it. In conflict, she always strategized to outwit her aggressive male opponents and avoid bloodshed. With Caesar Borgia, she tried to lure him into the drawbridge using her feminine wiles. Later, she tried to lure him deeper and deeper into the castle, trapping him in a protracted battle, giving her allies plenty of time to rescue her. She nearly succeeded in both efforts. This ability to play many different roles, to blend the masculine with the feminine, was the source of her power. The only time she relinquished this was in her marriage to Giacomo Fio. When she fell in love with Fio, she was in a highly vulnerable position. The pressures on her had been immense, dealing with a hopeless and abusive husband, surviving the numerous pregnancies that had worn her down, holding together the tenuous political alliance she had built up, and so suddenly experiencing Fio's adoring attention, it was natural for her to seek a respite from her burdens, to relinquish power and control for love. But in narrowing herself down to the role of the devoted wife, she had to repress her naturally expansive character. She had to expend her energy in pla- placating her husband's insecurities. In the process, she lost all initiative and paid the price, experiencing a deep depression that nearly killed her. She learned her lesson and afterward would remain true to herself for the rest of her life. Perhaps what is most surprising about the story of Caterina Sforza is the effect she had on the men and women of her time. She would expect that people would have condemned her as a witch or virago and shunned her for all her flaunting of gender conventions. Instead, she uh, fascinated almost everyone who came in contact with her. Women admired her strength. Isabella d'Este, the ruler of Mantua and her contemporary, found her inspiring and wrote after her capture by Bagori, "If the French criticize the cowardice of our men, at least they should praise the daring and valor of the Italian woman." Men of all types, artists, soldiers, priests, nobility, servants, obsessed over her. Even those who wanted to destroy her, like Caesar Borgia, felt an initial attraction and desire to possess her. Men could talk battle and strategy with her and feel like they were talking to an equal, not like the other women in their lives with whom they could barely converse. But more important, they sensed a freedom in her that was exciting. They also had to play a gender role. one that was not as constricting as a woman's role but had its advantages. They were expected to be always in control, tough, and indomitable. Secretly, they were drawn to this dangerous woman with whom they could lose control. She was not a feminine doll, all passive and existing only to please men. She was unrepressed and authentic, which inspired in them the desire to let go as well, to move past their own constricted roles. Understand, you might like to imagine that much has changed when it comes to gender roles, that the world of Catarina Sforza is too distant from our own to be relevant. But in thinking so, you would be greatly mistaken. The specific details of gender roles might fluctuate according to culture and time period, but the pattern is essentially the same and is as follows. We are all born as complete beings with many sides to us. We have qualities of the opposite sex, both genetically and from the influence of the parents of the other gender. Our character has natural depths and dimensions to it. When it comes to boys, studies have shown that in early age they are actually more emotionally reactive than girls. They have high degrees of empathy and sensitivity. Girls have an adventurous and exploratory spirit that is natural to them. They have powerful wills which they like to exert in transforming their environment. As we get older, however, we have to present to the world a consistent identity. We have to play certain roles and live up to certain expectations. We have to trim and lop off natural qualities. Boys lose their rich range of emotions and in the struggle to get ahead, repress their natural empathy. Girls have to sacrifice their assertive sides. They are supposed to be nice, smiling, deferential, always considering other people's feelings before their own. A woman can be a boss, but she must be tender and pliant, never too aggressive. In this process, we become less and less dimensional. We conform to the expected roles of our culture and time period. We lose valuable and rich parts to our character. Sometimes we can realize this only when we encounter those who are less repressed and we feel fascination with them. Certainly, Caterina Sforza had such an effect. There are also many male counterparts to this in history. The 19th century British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, Duke Ellington, John F. Kennedy, David Bowie, all men who displayed an unmistakable feminine undertone and intrigued people all the more for this. Your task is to let go of the rigidity that takes hold of you as you over identify with the expected gender role. Gender role. Power lies in exploring that middle range between the masculine and the feminine, in playing against people's expectations. Interesting. Return to the harder or softer sides of your character that you have lost or repressed. In relating to people, expand your repertory by developing greater empathy or by learning to be less differential. When confronting a problem or resistance from others, train yourself to respond in different ways, attacking when you normally defend, or vice versa. In your thinking, learn to blend the analytical with the intuitive in order to become more creative. See the final section of this chapter for more on this. Do not be afraid to bring out the more sensitive or ambitious sides to your character. These repressed parts of you are yearning to be let out in the theater of life. Expand the roles that you play. Don't worry about people's reactions to any changes in you they sense. You you are not easy you are not so easy to categorize, which will fascinate them and give you power to play with their perceptions of you, altering them at will. Quote, it is the terrible deception of love that it begins by engaging us in play, not with a woman of the external world, but with a doll fashioned in our brain. The only woman, moreover, than we have always at our disposal. The only one we shall ever possess. By Marcel Sprouse. In conclusion, Wow, that's the longest I've ever read. So I am exhausted. Holy shit! But I had to. I felt like it was like a workout. Like how I had my back workout today. I was like, oh shit, this is mental work killer. It was a good workout. Um, Pretty much it was interesting. Pretty much how man. I mean, I got lost in the story. Sephora's basically she had the masculine and the feminine. I mean, yeah, I was picturing that like okay, I can see that why men will fall for a woman that I mean, especially coming from a woman that can relate to like how we think our logic. Outro. Subscribe to the channel. Comment any questions you have. Like if the information was inspiring for you, and share this knowledge with other alchemists. Also, follow me on Instagram for more progressive knowledge. My Instagram is max underscore Bugatti underscore 8008. I'm all about family first. I'm a global stock investor. I'm a filmmaker. I'm an aerospace botanist, 420, and I have a masculine confidence building program. Currently, I'm out here in Cali, Colombia. While you're slaying dragons, I'll be taming them.